Hello everyone, today we talk briefly about a paradox about late medieval Scottish royal literature, at least of, say, literature written for the Scottish royals, highlighting one singular aspect, in fact, that there is hardly any ideological base that the monarchy lays from an ideological point of view, right, in literary works, right. There is a few, for example, commissioned works trying to exalt the monarchy and or to found some, greater myth of the origin, we can say, about specifically the ruling dynasty and beyond. This, of course, encompasses a bit the concept of the entire kingdom, that, as you know, in late medieval and early modern times will fundamentally maintain the traditional concept present also in common law. I mean, as it was definitely the normality in the Middle Ages, but that had been fundamentally challenged by the revival of Roman law, especially in the most developed kind of states, starting from France and beyond. And that wouldn't affect Britain. It would be, as we will see now also with Buchanan, etc., would pave the way, at least giving some ideological premises to the Reformation, to the idea of autonomy, if not independence, which in the case from a broader power, which in the case of Scotland naturally acquires a greater meaning as far as the wars for independence had been concerned. Naturally, those had been an important part of the national mythology of the country. In fact, would be resumed at some point also by other authors. Naturally, as we'll see, Scottish courtly life was active, like especially towards the end of the 15th century. There was an international competition, right? Especially with London, but also in general, that Scotland was also connected with France in many ways, exactly in the anti-English struggle, and was connection with Burgundy. There were literary influences and broader cultural ones, as far as properly what also the monarchy had to act like, to pose like, to affirm its greatness. Today we will not even specifically explain why the Scottish court wouldn't engage in this kind of ideological underpinning, right? The explanation may have to do with the nature of the Scottish monarchy, or how it had formed, right? Scotland becomes a feudal country to the fullest institutionally only in the 13th century, and also in more difficult ways that had been the case for England, for other great feudal monarchies in Europe. The reason being, again, political and social. That Scotland was less socially stratified, consequently it was less politically compact. The Scottish monarchs had fundamentally established a lowland power that also historically resented much from the Anglo-Saxon, the Norman influence, while the northwest was inhabited by, was ruled in a decentralized way by the king, and mostly made up by warlike clans that at some point were also somehow of dubious loyalty towards Edinburgh. And we have seen naturally also what the Kingdom of the Isle, the Earldom of Orkney really was today. We will remember the latter as far as this broader late medieval compaction of the kingdom was achieved. I made a video about medieval Scotland, like altogether last autumn, explaining a bit how the Stuarts, the Bruces before, successfully made Scotland step into that kind of probably full, in fact, monarchic institution, and making Scotland a truly independent state in this last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages. And we will have to keep talking about this. But the nature, right, of the country was still somehow less cohesive and somehow uninterested in defining, aside again from a moment of greater pressure from abroad. That is what created in great part the same late medieval kingdom as we know it. To, in fact, what they were, right? The mentality there, again, it was mostly clanic in nature. This was in many ways the same that the high nobility had in the rest of Europe, by a different degree, right? So the monarchy existing in virtue of the protection, the defense of pre-existing rights that just single rulers were come to protect, just as they were given power from the subject themselves. Naturally, this is a bit like the juristic view of it, and the at least in the traditional fashion, while the dynasts tended to affirm that there was something more, something sacred, as a matter of fact, inherent in the monarchic institution per se, and consequently also in those who embodied it in office. And this also developed on different levels. Actually, it was actually the English that brought, even in France, the concept of the apostatization of the institution. That is to say, the king never dies, right? And there is always some kind of persona that survives, even in, after the death of the king, and the election of the other, that actually automatically brings the scepter to the latter, and that, however, also must transition in ways that are essentially boasting the power of the monarchy per se, right? So it would be interesting. There's a beautiful work by Kantorowicz, naturally, the King's Two Bodies, that deals with this, and it would be interesting to see what is being written about Scotland specifically in relation to this mostly English and French idea, theory. And it would go perhaps too far to claim that there was a less courtly literature in Scotland because it was somehow a less developed country compared to others. It surely does have something to do with that, right? And that there is some wild character of the Scots that is stressed, and not just in an antagonistic sense, but sometimes literally as a sort of national identity of pride. So this fiery character and so on. Sometimes we tend to forget, like, in this kind of nationalistic competition about the institutions and what they are supposed to mean. Sometimes in times like, in fact, the Middle Ages, how primitive the world was at the time, and how, especially in areas such as, in fact, the Celtic fringe, how backwards things really were. This doesn't necessarily mean that, of course, generally speaking, this also equates to less power by a degree, but it doesn't mean that this wouldn't be able to eventually structure an identity, a national kind of feeling. That is also a very modern thing, at least in the semantics that we attribute to the term today, right? As we will see now, there was hardly even much of that, right? It's not that the lack of a monarchic, say, self-aggrandizing monarchic ideology at the Scottish court meant that, for example, it was rather a national one, right? Nationalistic one, nor that even the Scottish Wars of Independence were to produce anything particularly impactful along that pattern. I mean, there are some beautiful, of course, works that were produced stressing that patriotic feeling and so on, but much of that feeling itself, and especially for a military history-based channel like mine, it should be stressed. It did come from a sense of metus hostilis. This is how basically all countries are born from, in a way or another. There is hardly any pre-existing commonality of any sort, and it's just an illusion, and actually not. It can serve in a modern way to make things work better, but it still is the consequence of a shortcoming actually of the same people, meaning that if everybody were so powerful for some kind of cultural background, you wouldn't even need to direct them, to command them, to order them, because they should be able to do it by themselves. And equally, you can say that the more political cohesion there is, at least as far as the more political commitment in a cohesive way, let's put it in this way, because you may have very cohesive countries that are absolutely weak, right? They literally don't have any, they're paranoid and kind of lying and completely incapable of injecting moral forces, exactly because they've been destroyed in that. And you would be surprised by how dichotomically actual this thing is, right? Even when you look at great countries like France that achieved so much in imperial terms, in subtle terms, you realize that most of this mechanism also relied on fundamentally a moral depauperation of the masses in many ways, that at some point could benefit from being from living in the greatest power in Europe at that point. But in this sense, mostly following the trail, right, and not kind of, developing some conscientious autonomy as far as their individual commitment in it was concerned. Naturally, at some point, this had to be done, because also the most statically advanced France, in fact, had to do so by co-opting other elements. So it may sound strange to talk about meritocracy in that regard, but it's still something different, for example, from late medieval England, where, as we've seen, there was, in fact, no state, in at least in by French proportion. It was essentially a sort of high nobility or oligarchic feudal control, right, on the people. And so even as far as, for example, the concept of of liberties, of the constitution, etc., it was notoriously just like a baronial thing more often than not. And even when you find an autonomy of other communities, you realize that very often this equated to a greater weakness of those who had to control them, and not the other way around. So it's very complicated, because we are habituated to reason through the structure, which is in itself just the proof that you have lost your own personal liberty mentally, right? So you're not able to understand what kind of enforcement or approximation is needed to make things work, but at the same time channeling the force of free people, in a sense, in this enterprise. People confuse this all the time. They think, for example, just because a culture is formally traditional, like in some third world countries, that is allegedly bad. I mean, no, right? You can be traditional and completely screwing up that because you do not, as a people, as a culture, as a country, meet with the standards of tradition, and so it's completely useless. Let's say you enforce the Sharia just because it has something more traditional in nature, at least, because you have completely ceased to understand the meaning of it, and you don't actually use that to develop further power, but just to sclerotize and to weaken actually what is already essentially a weak people, and this is very rarely understood. In Europe, you can find, of course, it's a universal dynamic. You can find it to different degrees that are interesting to compare with the institutional development. But it's just a sidebar. So, as I was saying before, it's not even just a lack of monarchic propaganda in a sense, but it's even the lack of anything that could even encourage a concept of Scottish national identity. Now, we're talking about the 15th century, right? Of course, there is something dating from before that is important to appreciate, even some authors we will mention from the 14th that were, that was life straddled across the Bruces and the Stuarts. We're talking mostly about the Stuarts, the series of Jameses that ruled the country, by the way, with important strains, mostly this recurrent problem of minority, because for some reason either kings were captured or killed, whatever, and so there was always their children not being old enough to rule. There were a series of regents. So it's not an easy time for a country that, again, was still struggling, of course, to be updated in terms of what monarchic standards, even, again, in terms of government, centralized control really could be. The Stuarts at this point also neither tried to link such concept of national identity to themselves as dynasts. Yet another very important thing. They didn't present themselves, we're the great rulers of Scotland because we as Scots, and we have such great origins, we're so great, or whatever. No. They didn't even attempt to bind their subjects to a monarchy, which was either ancient or divinely ordained, and thus legitimized to rule over them. Probably, again, as we were saying before, if you had simply said this to an average Scottish peasant, it would have they would have not even cared, right? It was completely alien to their horizons, right? Whatever those Stuarts thought was a matter of, they were just essentially clansmen like others in their view, or at least they played at some higher sphere with other different means. But, they had just to think about their own cattle. I mean, what the hell cares about that? There are big problems about the world. The Stuarts are in charge, evidently, but the dynamics of political activity are felt to be determined by the nobility, generally speaking, as this constantly quarreling group that more or less owns the people, the land, the cattle, and so on. And that's basically it, right? And if you have to go to war, you go. If there is an opportunity in that sense, it's kind of part of life in a way. Of course, there were primitively brutal standards that you can observe. I made a video about late medieval Scottish warfare and also about 14th century Scottish infantry, which tells you a bit really how unsecular and unmodern the mindset of a Scottish, not even Highlander, it could even be a Lowlander, really was. In any case, going back to the Stuarts, there was a sort of humility in all this, right? It's difficult not to see it, right? Even if this had not properly been functional to something they could invest in that, because there weren't high enough spheres to spread that idea. There was no even Christian, of course there were Christian kings, but I mean there was no priestly, let's put it in this way, image to their dynasty. It was important in medieval Europe to have had a saint in your family, right? The Scots, aside from the Stuarts, but they would never develop the concept of royal touch, like the idea that you're somehow blessed by this sacred race, right? That basically did date back to gods, at least in the pagan view, and this somehow was reflected by the fitness still of the individual in a Christian optic. There was also no claim of particularly ancient ancestry, right? In the late 16th century, the Scottish historian and humanist George Buchanan boasted with pride that the two oldest monarchies in Europe were those of Denmark and Scotland, right? And depending on the criterion, of course, they were right, except, of course, there were older and actually much larger royal systems that would not already existed at that time, but had continued in practice in continental Europe. And this interest, of course, derived with Buchanan were already at the time of the Reformation. The Anglican schism had already happened, so there was an English model to imitate there, and many other things that would bring actually, in some decades at that point, actually the Stuarts on the same English throne. So it's a wholly different context in the Renaissance and so on. But so from a Scottish background between the 15th and the 16th century, we can appreciate the fact that those ideas at least were there. I'm not an expert in Buchanan's work, so should look also at how he would historically and philologically claim this, right? Whether it was a previous legacy and so on. Of course, as you'll see now, the Scots had been toying with their ideas of the origins and how their kingdom had formed and so on. However, this idea of Buchanan was not the one recognized institutionally by the Stuart monarchy, right? So Barbour, that, as you know, wrote again essentially between the Bruces and the Stuarts in the second half of the 14th century, had composed an ancestry for the Stuarts. In fact, he wrote this work known as the Stuartis Original. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. In the original, in fact, language. However, this was essentially a genealogical work, right, explaining how the Stuarts had come about. The problem is that this work is lost now, as unfortunately many sources from the same Middle Ages. And we know, however, that this work traced the Stuarts' origins back to the Trojans. When the work said every self-respecting Scotsman knew that his origins lay in ancient Greece and Egypt. And especially with the Achaeans, there was an important connection because they had been the conquerors of Troy. And as we've seen also recently, I don't remember in which video, the Normans, famously enough, had boasted their Trojan origin when they established their English, say, dominion, at least. So claiming that the Scots were the descendants of the Achaeans that had destroyed the Trojans / Normans, right, was a hell of a claim. As you understand, it's all a classicistic fabrication that it is, however, fascinating because it shows how the Scottish culture at that point was stepping importantly on the international scene, and they wanted to have also their own, in this case, Hellenic and Egyptian ancestry recognized, to say, look, we are here too, and we are not second to especially these English that want really to rule us at all costs, etc. And a lot of course, of elaborations were made up to make that. This is just an exception, like specifically of Barbour. But it's obvious that in all moments of political independence, there is a great kind of redrawing. There is kind of a part of even a sort of denial of some aspects of the recent past and so on. However, this concept of blood, the fact that still, as we remember before, Scotland was dominated by dynasts in a way or another, as clans, men, and so on, was also mixed, of course, with the feudal necessity of boasting some kind of noble blood of some sort. So if you claim to descend from the great heroes of antiquity, you could explain lots of different things. It was not important, like these people wouldn't write thinking that this was actually the case. I mean, they knew they were making that up. But in order to spur a sense of national identity, a patriotic feeling, these stories could circulate and kind of, interest people that, of course, in these last centuries of the Middle Ages were ever more interested in literature. Let's say literate in general. Again, as we were saying before, Scotland wasn't, perhaps the best example of this in absolute terms, but still, of course, the literary production, the cultural activity were increasing considerably. And given that this was a kingdom with a particular establishment, as we've seen, it was important to stress some sort of kinship, right, of common stock or something. It was something that would be of higher taste. And again, the monarchy does not engage in this, right? I will make a video explaining how specifically the Scottish nobility was claiming certain things, right? I mean, the Stuarts themselves, as you know their story, at least what they claimed, is that they descended essentially from some Brythonic, in fact, Stuarts, not even properly seneschals of the Counts of Dol in Brittany that had joined William the Conqueror back in the day and had been settled on the northwesternmost frontier of the Kingdom of England, and eventually through marriage ties had eventually married into the Bruces that had already become a Scottish part of the Scottish nobility, and eventually became kings of Scotland themselves, right? And already by the 13th century, say, lots of stories circulated around these essentially alleged ancestry dating back to the biggest deal that had ever happened in their view, that is the Norman conquest of England, right? All the English noblemen claimed that, we have the proof that our ancestors were these people in the army of William the Conqueror that came from wherever, from France, from Brittany, from Flanders, and so on. And we can trace that back. Like, a consistent part of this was made up, right? Genealogically, there were legion tales. Some, of course, of the stories were true, and we can even document them. The important thing, though, was being part of the big deal, right? So, in this kind of pre-humanistic temper of late medieval times, it was important to talk about Greece and Egypt and the Trojan War and so on to kind of sound as part of the cool kids club. Is there any political explanation, say most evidently one, for which the Stuarts would have not engaged in this kind of rhetoric and propaganda and ideology? Well, the Stuarts had a rough time as they were in charge. I mean, the problems with England, as you know, wouldn't quite stop. There were internal issues with, of course, unfaithful vassals, these kind of coups, internal strives, and so on. So it's not necessarily that they tried to keep a low profile necessarily because of that, because normally in times of crisis, actually, and the more actually you don't have power, you do tend to boast to have one. But in this sense, the Stuarts were too busy, and in a world that they had to cope with much more direct means, right, and to probably develop something so refined that can occur only when you have probably a stable context, like we will see now at the very end of the 15th century, and problems were not over even at that time. So no myths, no special heroic ancestry, etc. The Stuarts instead emphasized exactly that their origins were somehow recent and not even heroic, because properly even the name of James Stuart, and of course the sequence of kings, they called all the same way throughout this period, James the First, Second, Third, Fourth, etc., were properly Jacobus Senescallus, right? So literally the Stuart James, as they had been in fact the stewards of the Counts of Dol in Brittany, according to the Norman epos of the English conquest, right? So they were just household stewards in their view, and they were fine with that. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why still today the Prince of Wales numbers among his titles Steward of Scotland is actually the echo of the same Stuart's in fact rhetoric in late medieval times, stressing the fact that they were just that in practice, right? Stewards of the household that in this sense would have become, this is a bit maybe the monarchic ideology, the stewards of the kingdom, right? So the idea of being servants of, and or at least something more, the steward was an important figure. This is seneschal, as somebody provided, however, with some kind of household mansions, right? And even the latter's concept, like the fact that now the stewards had stepped up in the scale of their office to a royal one, was random and rare in the sources. It had nothing to do specifically with an ideology of kingship, which could stress either antiquity or divinity. It was just, it happened to us to become kings like this, which might have seemed also already a big deal for them, and this may actually be a proof of confidence of some sort. The fact that they didn't need to make up things to convince anyone about their role. After all, they were kings of Scotland. They would remain for centuries. There are some kind of nationalist writers that emphasize on kingship, and unsurprisingly enough, these authors write in the field of the specula principis. So the king's, the prince's mirror, right? And this is a slightly different thing from kind of a royal literature, though. Even in here, in fact, the stewards, first of all, don't support particularly, they don't commission or anything. There is no evidence, essentially, of even a step in the creation of these works. And one of the reasons may be that, of course, the Speculum Principis is, is hopefully a spontaneous work, right? You can write it, as James VI will do at the end of the 16th century, when the genre finally, in fact, became recurrent for the stewards, albeit, that would not last for too long. But in that case, it's from father to son within, of course, a monarchist reality, much more affirmed, kingdom and royalty, in the, even, in fact, controlling multiple realms. In the 15th century, you would hope that a Speculum Principis would be written spontaneously by, and hopefully by, an admirer of the king, that still, would set some standards by, of course, expressing a subtle criticism. But the king himself doesn't want to be lectured, right? He is just affirmed in his own majestas, and as such, you don't quite even see a a connection with this work and the monarch, if not as an advice, in fact, as a model to pursue that probably he doesn't quite stick to completely. In more practical terms, it's obvious that a speculum principis that would be allowed to circulate to become something would have had to be approved by the monarch itself, and so much of what had to be written in the work would have to praise the current king, or at least with some references also to his times in his background in general, and so on, right? Also in here, if we compare, for example, the Scottish and the English literature of the Specula Principis, we notice that from Edward III to Edward IV, uninterruptedly, the English kings had received at least one book, sometimes even more, of advice to princes. In Scotland, by the way, of course, as a broader British context, those English works circulated. They were read, they were, definitely studied to see whether something could be drawn in models, in style, etc. for the Scottish monarch. However, even though James I had some pretty, say, lofty things to state about the impartial justice that he would offer as a king, that was, I guess, one of, if not his, at least in theory, the primary duty of a king after protecting the country. He wouldn't encourage specific authors such as Bauer to write about the just king, right? Bauer was a clergyman. He was prepared already to praise James' rule, that case, to support the monarchy, and so that work just came about without royal prompt, as far as we can see. And consider that James I's claims, boasting, etc., is motivated by its own context. Of course, the fact that the monarch had been imprisoned for 18 years in England, right? And the fact that when he had come back to Scotland, he had carried out an important repression of those who had basically caused that interregnum, let's put it this way, and so he ruthlessly acquired parts of his subjects' lands and so on. But that was part of a political game that was also kind of, in fact, quite royally obvious given the circumstances. And it's also interesting to read the same work of James in prison, right? And he quite interestingly reflects on his own misery. He refers to Boethius and, of course, the consolation of philosophy that philosophy could offer in prison. He looks out of his prison's window and he falls in love with what I think the same character that would become his wife later, and naturally she represents a divine wisdom, and it's the older kind of heroic topos there. That literature would be recovered later in a more kind of pathetic sense, like stressing, for example, the fears, the doubts of this individual in the prison, like why, like this, of course my power has been limited like this. So it's a spiritual journey. There is a lot of traditional archetypal meaning, but perhaps this being shipwrecked afterwards also because, of how the monarchy came to be, and it was already kind of mitigated, like in Britain, not just in England, as a matter of fact, and what all we said before, right? We have other works like Gilbert Hayes' mid-15th century book of the governance of princes. This is essentially a translation of the pseudo-Aristotelian Secretum Secretorum, written for William Sinclair, the Earl of Orkney. So you realize that the nobility had, of course, similar ambitions to the monarchic ones, at least in model, right? The Earls of Orkney were some of the most important vassals of the Scottish monarchy. They had quite a power on their own, and in general, as we were saying before, the courts, as modest as they could be in some areas, they did have international ambitions, connections. So it was important to, let's say, stick to, by now, the mid-15th century, some quite classical humanistic models, right, that would prefigure the Northern Renaissance and so on. There is the highly critical Tre Prestes of Peblis and Lancelot of the Lake, also written both in the mid-15th century, that are of this, they fall in this genre, but they are not royal works, such as Robert Henryson's Moral Fabilis wasn't, as far as the comments on kingship could make them close to that royal milieu as well. There is reference in the anonymous poem "The Harp" that would be attached to the Liber Pluscardensis, speaking of "my sovereign lord Santo has given me life," which we think could have actually been commissioned by James II. But this is matter of debate. I'm not expert in the philological critique of it, so I just refer what I read. There are so these scattered hints and possibilities. Of course, we have to think, of course, the stewards weren't just sitting ducks there. What they read, they had literary interests themselves. They wrote, they composed. The closest approximation to a true speculum principis is the 7th book of John's Ireland Mirror of Wisdom. This was written for James IV, so you understand here also that the genre developed over time, just as the monarchy was doing. And it draws massively from the work of Jean Gerson, who was a French theologian and philosopher, highlighting, of course, the Franco-Scottish connections that had existed from quite a while, historically, politically, militarily, but also culturally, like in this case. And it somehow evidences a native interest, doesn't matter how foreign inspired, let's say, for a political history of fact, the Scottish kingdom, right? There is a single monarchy emerging as essentially the core of it all, right? It's just through the Basilicon d'Oran, so the royal gift of James VI to his son Henry at the end of the 16th century, so 1 century afterwards, that yet, however, the speculum principis would affirm itself now as a continuum in the Stuarts' court. As we've seen, there was also a lesser level, let's say, of literary production that, as we've seen, was naturally read by the same kings. And if this was the case, of course, if you wanted to show off at court, it was important to have kind of praise the monarch in a way or another, right? Of course, there were also those who not much opposed the kingdom as such, or the dynasty even, but naturally they didn't have any particular interest in kind of just expressly praising the monarchy at a given moment. But this is not important, because at the end of the day, Scotland had been grouped together at that point under the monarchy. There was no, let's say, extravagance in that. Yet even at this point, there is no evidence that the Stuarts were particularly interested in any of these works specifically. This is important in the history of literature, because you would always, especially given the genre in particular, look at the connection with the monarch, what they would react like, and what connection. In these Stuarts do not show any specific interest in these works per se. It's not documented, it's not evidence. We don't know about that by some degree. But if they had, there would have probably been an important amount of evidence regarding that, or at least some meaningful one. There is also kind of a problem of national historiography, because it's obvious that for Scottish history it's important to prove in a way or another that there was some kind of monarchic self-ideologization for the sake of the unity, of the independence of the Scots, and so on. Surely there was literary life at court, which, especially towards the end of the century, was vibrant and surely relevant in that context, even by European standards. As we've seen, the Scottish monarchy was pretty strained during this century by interruptions, right, of regencies, wars, etc. This would bring some pauses in the tempo of courtly activity in general, right? At least in this kind of more entertainment fashion, right? Some literature was very light, even at least even in topic. There were some, of course, artistic tensions, insults, even vulgar themes by some degree. Like we don't know of all that was sung and told and acted at court. And in fact, we have problems in understanding what the Scottish monarchy relation with these works was, because given the circumstances, it was also more difficult to make the crown a literary patron of sort. Right? Only in the last decade of the 15th century, we can appreciate a direct involvement on the basis of the sources, with a expressed documentation of this phenomenon. The political thermometer is important as well. Not always kings were particularly appreciated even by the subjects. James I back in the day was importantly criticized mostly for the taxation raised for his English ransom that we mentioned before, as ending up to fuel the luxuries of his court eventually. And I must say, after you've been in prison for 18 years, you maybe want some luxury finally in your own court. Just a dumb joke. The point being, though, that of course there was much more literature than the one we can see circulating, missing pieces, right? We know, of course, also some broader cultural activity that tells you what also the kings could be interested in. For example, in 1448, the famous Burgundian Walloon, specifically knight Jacques de Lalaing, and two of his companions came to Scotland, right, at the royal court, bringing with them from Burgundy, it was of course the most updated chivalric court in Europe, right? It was just Burgundy, like all the greatest knights, in fact, just like Jacques and many other commanders, the same dukes of the Crusades, it all came from there, right? So Burgundy was close enough, of course, to Britain in the political space, and it was important for the Scottish court to receive such distinguished guests that on that occasion fought in what was not sure whether a pas d'armes specifically. It degenerated in a brawl, actually, in which the Burgundian knight fought against Sir James Douglas, right, and two other Scottish knights. So it was essentially a tourney of six in the presence of the same James. The second would on that occasion also knighted these individuals. The story behind that is quite interesting, because at this point tournaments had become very mediated in many ways, and it was an occasion to make money. As you know, the lesser nobility had, generally speaking, underwent a crisis during the late Middle Ages, so this man just lived off of literally these professional tournament performances, and it could shipwreck sometimes in terms of loyalty or prefixed rules, but there were still kind of famous people, and surely quite fascinating ones. And on that occasion, it is evident that James II had, first of all, presided, but also with pomp and ceremony, right? Doesn't matter how the tourney had degenerated into a brawl, but the King of Scotland wanted to boast some proper courtly authority and control and power. We know less about James III. We are told, generally speaking, as a bit of old legend, that he was culturally and artistically versed, right? And especially he had an interest in his lower status favorites at court, for which he was ferociously criticized. There is much malignity there. We don't know exactly how the thing went. But there was the obvious display, for example, of architectural glory at the Great Hall of Stirling. Of course, a quite poignant location. There is the work of James IV, his son, who wanted to build new castles, right, and following the footsteps of his great-grandfather, James I, and also his grandfather, by the way, at Lillington and Falklands, by building at both Stirling and Holyrood. And James III was also enthusiastic in this kind of Stuart's fashion. He was pretty much obsessed with guns, which, as you know, that for a technical fault had killed the same James II at the siege of Roxborough in 1460, but that were a bit like the one of the major interests, say, of European princes at the time, because artillery had become now indispensable. And as you know, there is the Mont Meg still displayed at the Castle of Edinburgh. That it's also a Burgundian gift, by the way, to the King of Scotland, and that really represents one of the largest bombards of the time. And again, production was still very unstandard, so it was normal to have, we made videos about this, larger pieces that were also nicknamed, like in that case, and lots of smaller others, but it was important to show off by towering, just like the king was meant to do at this point over the rest of the nobility, by displaying the best ones, the largest ones that you could also show there to be able to adequately supply, which was yet another issue, It's interesting that as backward as Scotland could be, actually guns spread more or less at the same time the rest of Europe, and every Scottish clan leader essentially could boast one. It was important. This is something we've seen also among the West Highlanders. They knew, of course, how to operate any right of that. But they mostly would fight the way they did still in medieval times, even in the 17th century, because most of the times, even the places habituated them, they were functional to that. It was useless to spend too much for technology, but you could still show off by, if it were the bigger one, to have the cool car, etc. And sometimes it was just an ideological matter, but it could be important, and it's exemplified in this royal order as we've seen here. The same goes for ships. Famously enough, James IV was particularly keen on them. He spent actually wide sums on a navy which wouldn't practically be even used by the Scots, because it was sent to France in 1513, and there is the famous Great Michael, which I also uploaded a picture of the model here. It's a pretty famous one, and that was so wow for people of the time, including Henry VIII, who had the Henri Grâce à Dieu constructed to the same scale of his Scottish counterpart, exactly because of envy at the end of the day. So it's obvious that the Scottish monarchs had their own ambitions and extravagances, and surely they had been looking at literature by some degree. We find important scholars and writers operating at the Scottish court, right? James I himself was certainly a poet. He wrote The King is Square. Only, however, with James IV, we have a monarch that properly displays his patronage to a similar scale to the rest of European powers. Consider that he had famously married Margaret Tudor in 1503, which entailed the display of an adequate amount of splendor, especially as far as the royal entry into the capital was concerned, and thus, showing also the rest of Europe that Scotland was already, updated and familiar in the modes adopted, especially in France and England, and already, by the way, from quite a while, so proving with such an international marriage that the Scots could catch up with the current fashion, as they had never practiced yet. It's also in James IV's reign that court poetry emerges, at least clearly, right? We can trace it. There's a famous figure, William Dunbar, who would become famous for his literary tense-on with William Kennedy. And all this occurred, let's say, with an uneven pattern. Of course, this depended mostly on Scottish politics, court life, right? We've seen ships, poetry, guns, tournaments, and the objective of the Scots was primarily outshining the English court, which was a bit difficult, but also successful to provoke an anti-Scottish satire in England that felt somehow embittered by this, for a actually failed court poet such as John Skelton, that is considered minor today, but actually wrote interesting things. Proves the sense is, of course, that the Scots were the barbarians of the situations. I mean, that they were wild people that wouldn't have just like the same cultural life of the court that another country could have. So they were mocked and belittled. But the Stuarts of force were actually consistent and also with the standards of the international culture. So Scotland had definitely gained her place among the European monarchies. So the presence of a strong rule, after all, by that point, in spite of the the vicissitudes of the various monarchs, right, and the general trouble that like a late medieval, early modern kingdom could have in general, there is a striking lack in Scotland of a royal propaganda encouraging people, sometimes even with enforcing means, to identify with the nation's divinely ordained king. Probably, again, my take is that the political and social structures were just not ready for it, but also because there was not much of a reason, much to gain from it in the first place, right? There was a cohesion already accomplished by just the international stand of Scotland politically, and the benefits that, of course, a Stuart's rule would just incarnate for the country. Of course, also in the rest of Europe, we don't find an homogeneous pattern. Right? We mostly compare this with the, let's say, most feudally powerful monarchies, and especially the closest ones to Scotland, so the English and the French ones. What is striking is the fact that the Scottish kings didn't, however, even properly tried, or at least they seem to be homogeneous. Like this could vary from person to person, right? From condition to condition. Lots of things change throughout all this, and yet it's somehow still foggy why this trend is observed. There was a saying debated at the time, fier comme un Écossais, right? So fiery as a Scotsman, which during the Renaissance echoed for a while, because as we've seen also in those videos about the early modern mercenaries, lots of Scotsmen also fought abroad. They were renowned for the fact that they would come from this periphery of Europe to, in a more kind of warlike, with a more kind of a tribal background, sometimes still to serve in some of the major wars in the continent, and there was an ancestral pride attached to the Scottish identity. As we've seen in the video about medieval Scotland, this dated back to the early Middle Ages. It had been refined during the high ones, and by late medieval times now the identity of Scotland, of the Scots, was just a given datum, right? One aspect, however, that can help us understanding, and maybe also we'll talk about this on another occasion because it's an interesting topic, and I'm sure we can come up with an explanation of such identities. Always somehow, say, low-key in a way, right? There is at least no firm ideological concept or base, right? Scotland was largely, in fact, also a kind of a traditional country. The local identities were connected with the local clans, with the local communities, rather than, of course, something kind of higher in nature. Like the monarchy had still, however, proven to be possible to install and to make work successfully. So it's mostly the moments of greater crisis that could produce a common feeling. Again, the Scottish Wars of Independence against the English had been the the peak of this, and that's when a properly Scottish myth of the origins erupted in a full-grown form, by the way, without apparently much of a background. This is also paid, as we'll see now, in terms of historiographical reliability and all these kind of things. But it's obvious that from the times of the Malleus Scothorum, and in fact, Edward I's invasion of the country with the explicit intention, simply claiming that Scotland was under English domination as a normal imperial datum that the Anglo-Saxons had always believed in, and in the very first moment they stepped in Britain, had generated a sense of themselves. Of course, there were peoples that spoke a different language. By that point, it was still. I mean, most people in Scotland spoke Gaelic at the time. It was evident that in an island like Britain, those were a people, and the English were another. There were others as well, as you know, the boundaries in that sense between Ireland and especially Western Scotland are pretty blurred, as much as there is some commonality with Wales that by this point has, however, been fundamentally absorbed by England. However, we can see the simplicity, right? Sometimes the naivety, as far as a literary model is concerned, to make up for that lack of, especially written, ideological identity. This is perhaps a very overlooked aspect. That, of course, most of the identitary tradition in the Celtic fringe was orally transmitted, right? So when we look, for example, at the Irish Lebor Gabal Erin, that is sort of, in fact, Gaelic epos, framed within a Christian universal chronology, but essentially wanted to imitate the Old Testament. I mean, making a great epos of the Irish people, but we're talking about, it dates back to somehow old tradition, and there is a lot of debate there of how much there is pseudo history, and in fact how much the oral tradition connected itself with the written one. Some stuff is, of course, completely made up. It's anachronistic. It also derives from a corpus of texts that were brought together in a very kind of, not necessarily sloppy, but somehow just in fact fabricated fashion, right, as far as the reliability of the content is concerned, and just the structure was put together. And interestingly enough, the Scots at that point drew from it as well, because, as you know, it was just like a bit of a common background, because the Scots originally, at least as a name, came from Ireland, right, and the inhabitants of modern Scotland roughly decided to adopt that as an identity, aside from, of course, the Irish immigration in Scotland during the early Middle Ages, late Antiquity. And there is a quite funny picture of this, showing Scotta and Gatelus sailing to Scotland, right, in the foundational moment. This is preserved in an illumination, in fact, in a Fordun manuscript dating to the 40s of the 15th century. And the funniest thing is that these guys are supposed to be, the hardcore, Celtic guys that found mythically, because, what's the difference in that context between mythos and history? They wouldn't see it much. It was much less secular, modern view on it from the Celtic fringe perspective than it would be for the more civilized England. Wearing what are evidently highly fashionable Burgundian hats of the same 15th century. So it's ridiculous, but it's funny, and it's also, of course, important, because aside from now the French connection that could have surely contributed to develop that sense of Scottishness, because, as you know, the alliance with France was the old alliance, as a matter of fact, with against the English, and so it was a recurrent dynamic in Scottish history. And the French influence is, of course, is civilizational, as far as also, in fact, properly the development of a feudal monarchy and some court etiquette and so on. Well, they naturally, the Scottish took from the English as well by direct contact, but what's direct contact, right? France was also that close by sea. It's evident in that moment, in the 14th and the 15th century, when a proper Scottish literature emerges in a national sense, connected to the kingdom, etc., that there was a sense of themselves that the Scots had that they couldn't express, say, in a literary fashion according to particularly refined or even coherent models, but that surely stemmed from a moral background that they had, is the same used to essentially win the Scottish wars of independence against the English. Because it's the sense of freedom, right? This is quite famous in the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320. You have properly the international shout-out with some of the most moving of all the medieval conceptions of the community of the realm. Some of the most famous English translated phrases sounding as long as only 100 of us, the Scots, remain alive, we will never, on any conditions, be brought under English rule. Spoiler, that would happen anyway. And this is beautiful, especially for me. Fight not for glory, nor riches, nor honors, but for freedom alone, which no good man gives up except with his life. Right? And this is a bit like the true spirit of their wars of independence that had evidently succeeded and would remain, also quite romantically, as sadly in the rest of Scottish history, for that, right? You can, of course, criticize politologically, philosophically, what you mean by freedom, as opposed to liberty, or that's another problem that the Scots would impose themselves, because they knew perfectly well what they wanted, and as long as they could get it, they succeeded. It's always important to speak of a national genesis through the different means that could be employed at the time. The Middle Ages is often like this. Like you would like to know what even just a 14th century peasant could think like, and of course we know something about that. But aside from the fact that, of course, we cannot fully know, for some of these realities, we literally know too few, right? These are places in Europe where largely time stopped, right? And that's the reason why eventually Scotland would also simply be absorbed by the English. But the question is, what can we know, right? Is there a method that can help us? Well, of course, you always remember that there is a huge, like what we see here is the tip of the iceberg. So, of course, there are better videos I can make regarding kind of medieval identities, nationally, ethnically, linguistically, whatever, right? What expresses this best, in my opinion, is the existence of Scotland without the need, especially by the crown, to say anything essentially about nationhood, right? Nor explaining why nor self-justifying themselves in front of the subjects, like it was being done in England, in France, in Aragon, and Castile. Not because these countries were kind of course they were stemming from larger realities, some multinational ones as well, that a center had somehow imperially subjugated, and so the importance of a greater unity is greater there, right, than in Scotland. A smaller country, less people, more homogeneous ethnically, right, culturally, linguistically, essentially without much of an external input, right, to also to that could destabilize at that point the system, because fundamentally England and Scotland at this point are somehow well balanced, right, in terms of also of how the political and military activity could kind of make them interfere with each other, right? So there is no need, if the thing works, to just say anything about it. And this, I think, is crucial, really, to explain even this apparent lack of, literary, ideological development and so on, that is, again, in line with the level of development of the country, but also a country that didn't need, in fact, that to feel itself as one, right? And or to at least be what it had always been. And mostly, of course, the average Scotsman at this point mostly thought, like, again, in clanic terms. Still, not in a tribal sense, but literally in at that point a feudal one, right? So even there, we don't actually know what kind of an average peasant normally thought about politics or about nationhood or whatever. It would be interesting to deepen that much, but the point is that most of them wouldn't even need to think about that, because we are the ones obsessed with it and just project all the picture, like, in this way. Like, even this video fundamentally is trying to answer that question, and the obvious answer is that there is not an answer, that it's partially a question that doesn't make much sense just per se, right? So I'm glad I haven't made so many videos about Scotland, about the British Isles. Like, when I look at the playlist, eventually I say, well, it's not that few, right? But considering the amount of stuff that's being researched in the Anglosphere about this place, I always feel like I'm making too few. Anyhow, I'm also careful not to talk proportionally about everyone, at least as far as my knowledge, but also sense of hierarchy really is, because I would talk much more often about England than Scotland, at least not excessively much more, but you have to dose the info in a way that also makes you understand. In this powers today, we haven't touched on this, but also how politically powerful they were, because Scotland at the end of the Middle Ages was something. Right, it wasn't an isolated kingdom lost somewhere. It was, as we've seen here, a player in Europe, and it was a now the English couldn't quite subjugate Scotland like they had thought at the peak of medieval civilization in the early, say, in the 13th, in late 13th, and the early 14th century, right? So and also the Scottish accomplishments stemmed exactly from the crisis that they had to undergo, and considering that up to that point with Balliol, there was a general idea that kind of the English can step in Scotland, they're our overlords, right? Well, somebody stepped up and said, you know what, no, we have the chance to make it different, right? And they succeeded, right? So for the rest of the Middle Ages, that was quite of an accomplishment. And you can find all of this in my Medieval Scotland playlist. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.